Hi everyone, I would like to welcome you to the third webinar of our seminar entitled Automation and Digitalization in Contemporary Capitalism. I'm Edmilson Paraná, professor of economic sociology and sociology of work at the Federal University of Ceará here in Brazil, and I will be your host today. Our seminar is jointly organized by three research groups in different Brazilian universities, namely the Research Group in Political Economy of Development at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Norte, the Research Group in Economy, Technology and Society at the Federal University of Ceará, and the DigiLabor Research Lab at the Unicinos University. Today, our guest speaker is Aaron Benanav, who kindly accepted our invitation to discuss his new book, Automation and the Future of Work, recently published by Verso in 2020, the end of 2020. Aaron Benanav is an economic historian and social theorist. Currently, he holds a postdoctoral researcher position at the Humboldt University of Berlin. Before joining Humboldt, Benanav was a Harper Schmidt Fellow in the Social Science at the University of Chicago. So, we will start with Benanav's presentation, and afterwards, we will have a Q&A session. Aaron, many thanks for being today with us, for kindly accept our invitation, and you have now the floor. Thanks so much.
Great. So, is my presentation visible? Great. Okay, perfect. So thank you so much. I'm really excited to have this opportunity to share my work with you. I'm going to speak for maybe about 45 minutes, and then I'll take comments and questions. So the title of my talk today is Automation and the End of Work, Labor Market Dynamics Between Innovation and Stagnation. And it's really drawn from the second and third chapters of my book, Automation and the Future of Work. So the basis for the talk and for the wider book is to respond to a group of automation theorists who claim that we're living in an age of accelerating technological change. And I have some titles of some recent books from this field, books like The Second Machine Age, The Rise of the Robots, Andrew Yang's book, The War on Normal People, which then became the basis of this big candidacy for the Democratic, candidate for president, and now he's probably going to become mayor of New York. He's a big proponent of this, and Daniel Susskind's A World Without Work. So a big claim of these authors is that jobs are being destroyed at such a rapid pace that the labor market is simply unable to recover. And the research question that kind of guides my book is this really the end of work? That is to say, is automation responsible for the growing difficulty workers face today in finding or holding on to jobs? So the argument that I'm going to make in my talk today, as well as in the book, is that the pace of technological change in the economy right now only appears to be speeding up. The real issue, which is generating the problems that the automation theorists are talking about, is that economic growth rates are actually slowing down. This slowdown is what's generating the persistently low demand for labor that the automation theorists identify. And that slowdown in turn provides the key backdrop for thinking about and researching the expansion of insecure work in the digital economy today. So I'm going to start off with just providing some background on the key claims that these automation theorists make. And then I'm going to take you through my argument. So the background is just that we do live in an age of big technological development. So we are living in a time of advanced industrial robotics. This is the Tesla plant in Fremont, California, where Elon Musk and his associates have been pushing towards so-called lights out production, where they don't have any people involved in the production process. Another really important technology coming online today is machine learning, deep learning, neural networks, which are variants of so-called narrow AI. And there's questions about whether we might be advancing towards a more general form of artificial intelligence. A third development in digital technologies, which these authors tend not to talk about very much because for now, at least, it does rely on a lot of labor, is of course the platform economy. But Uber and Lyft have been talking for a long time about their long-term goals of replacing all of their drivers with driverless cars. So while these technologies are coming online, we've seen a number of disturbing trends in the labor market. And here I'm going to focus on the US economy, although in the book, I really try to give an account that's much more global in scope. But just focusing on the US, what we've seen over the past 40 years or so is a process of what economists have sometimes called jobless recoveries. And what that means is that after each recession, employment levels fall, and it takes longer and longer for employment levels to recover their pre-recession peak. So you can see here from the early 80s to the early 90s to the early 2000s to the global financial crisis, we've had longer and longer recovery times for the labor market to recover after each recession. But really, this isn't only a story about job loss and hence unemployment. It's also a story about underemployment and about all the ways that workers, when they do get jobs, find that the jobs they get either pay less than their previous jobs, don't use the skills that they've acquired, or don't offer them full-time or permanent work. And one way of looking at that is just to look at this growing gap between productivity growth and wage growth. There's a very famous graph of this for the United States that shows that in the 1970s, wage growth for production and supervisory workers stagnated while productivity continued to grow. This is the same graph for all of the OECD countries as a whole in the 90s and the first 13 years of the 2000s, showing this growing gap between the growth of labor productivity and the growth of average wages, and even more so, the gap between the growth of labor productivity and real median wages. So the question is, are these technological innovations that I started with connected to these labor market trends, and how? What is the connection between them? Well, this new automation discourse that I started off talking about says very strongly, yes, there's a very strong connection. As these new labor-destroying technologies have come online, that's what's causing all of the jobs to go away. So one way to approach this question, much like the automation theorists themselves, is to think of the story in terms of a pure technology story, and to think about a kind of technology axis which just looks at the characteristics of technologies in terms of whether they augment human labor power or replace human labor power. So augmenting technologies would be things like the assembly line, or certain kinds of Web 2.0 developments, or Amazon warehouses, which make workers, the existing workforce, more productive. Automation technologies would be technologies like driverless cars, or eventually kind of artificial general intelligence, which would really replace workers, right, and take them out of the production process. Now, a very famous study on this, the so-called Oxford-Martin study, originally released as a working paper in 2013, predicted that without a clear time horizon, they just said existing technologies can be used to automate 47% of jobs. So that was the big headline number, which you see just repeated over and over again in the media. The OECD, as well as MIT and McKinsey and other groups, have rerun the numbers with a more fine-grained analysis, and they suggest that given current technologies, only about 14% of jobs today are at a high risk of automation, with the remainder identified by the Oxford-Martin study much more likely to see augmentation rather than automation. But researchers have long cast doubt on this pure technology story, so we have to kind of complicate that account in any case. When automation theorists talk about technologies, they usually talk about it with charts like this one, which show a long-term growth in the processing power of computer technologies that seems to just unfold relentlessly over time. And in their view, what happens is computers become cheaper and more productive, and over time, they first become more powerful than a mouse brain, and then eventually they'll be more powerful than a human brain, and eventually beyond that, more powerful than all human brains, and that will lead to what Ray Kurzweil famously called the singularity. So this is a kind of technologist's account of technology change. But what sociologists and other science and technology researchers have long shown is that the actual ways that technologies are implemented in production really varies and has a lot to do with power relations within the workplace. So as an example of this, one might think that the assembly line is just the way one produces cars fast and efficiently. But in the 1980s and 90s, Volvo actually experimented with abolishing the assembly line. They were trying to make work more satisfying, create conditions of fixed car production where small teams of 8 to 12 workers would assemble an entire car from start to finish. And they did that under the pressure of full employment, which continued into the 80s in Sweden, as well as pressure from the unions and high rates of labor turnover and so on. So that social context matters. And that's why a lot of theorists have responded to the advent of this new automation discourse by complicating the analysis and adding a social access, thinking about how technologies are actually implemented. Are they being implemented in production in ways that are alienating for workers, or are they being implemented in ways that give workers autonomy, where autonomy is understood in terms of the degree to which workers have self-directed work, get to use skills that they've already acquired, and have a feeling of social purpose in the work that they do. And of course, those kinds of feelings, that autonomy within work, is very connected to specific histories of workers' solidarity, their bargaining power, and the institutional framework within which labor is taking place. So on this basis, alongside this emergent automation discourse, we've seen a kind of sociological and social theoretical response. Books like Uberland by Alex Rosenblatt have really explained how much Uber drivers, are being affected by the technologies that are implemented at Uber. Promises of freedom and setting one's own schedule turn out to be not quite true, as workers find that they're very precarious, that algorithmic management has certain qualities that force them to work on schedules that they wouldn't choose. At the same time, books like Ghost Work by Mary Gray and Siddharth Suri have investigated all of the hidden labor, the kind of fake automation that goes into the platform economy, and especially on social media sites like Facebook, where actually large teams of workers are paid very low wages to look through social media content at grotesque images that are flagged by users. A person actually has to look at those and say whether they are appropriate or not. So there's all this hidden labor in the digital economy. Now, on these accounts, an argument that the social theorists are making who are contesting the automation account is to say that if we look at how these technologies are actually being implemented, in spite of the claim that these technologies are getting rid of work, we see that the work being created in the digital economy tends to locate in this space that I've highlighted on this sort of little graph that I've made. You can see that most of the technologies are generally alienating, whether they're augmenting or to some extent automating in character. Now, my account is that there's really a missing variable in the discussion as it's being had so far that undermines a lot of the ways that technology is being talked about in both the kind of boosterish automation theorist account, as well as in some of the more critical technological accounts as well. And that missing variable is the macroeconomic context. And to start to get at what I mean by this, we could look at this article that recently came out by Juliet Schor, who's a really important researcher in the field. She said in her recent article in Theory and Society, the platform economy must be partially understood in relationship to the general labor market. She points out that in the early days of her research on the gig economy, we found that many providers opted for platform work because they were unable to find conventional employment in the wake of the Great Recession. And she actually refers to work from 2018, 2019, where researchers are saying, wow, a lot of workers who would be entering the gig economy because labor markets are tightening in the US are actually choosing not to go there and instead to get more conventional jobs. And so based on this comment, we might think about the kind of larger context of workers' search for work, that macroeconomic context. Here, I've just created a little graph of the relationship between wage growth and unemployment, nominal wage increases and unemployment from 86 to 2018. And what you can see is a clear inverse relationship. Periods where the dotted line, where unemployment is very high, tend to be periods of very low wage growth. And periods where unemployment falls are periods of higher wage growth. And these periods of high and low wage growth correspond to periods where workers have weaker or stronger bargaining power and are able to fight for all kinds of non-wage benefits at work as well. But what you can see in this graph, which shows you just kind of cyclical trend, right, is the secular dynamic, what's happening over the course of multiple business cycles. And what you'd see if you kind of zoomed out is that we've been going through a very long process, especially in the OECD, but also in the world as a whole, of secular stagnation. What that means is that over time, business cycle by business cycle, the economy has been growing at a slower and slower pace. So here, the OECD countries, we see that the growth rate was around 5% per year in the early 1960s, falling to under 2% per year in the 2010s. And actually that trend line I've put there doesn't even include the major fall in economic growth during the 2020 pandemic recession. If that were included, the recent period would, of course, have an even lower average rate. So my account is that this slowing growth, not accelerating technological change, is what's causing the low demand for labor, and it's shaping the implementation of digital technologies. In fact, I'm going to argue that technological change, as measured by productivity growth rates, is actually happening at a much slower pace today than in the past, and that contradicts a lot of the ways that technology is being talked about in current accounts. So my account is that this low demand for labor, given this slowing growth, is what encourages the digital economy to develop in ways that are alienating for workers. In short, employers find that they don't have to take workers' perspectives, their needs into account in making investment decisions because of this general context of low demand for labor and a high degree of employment insecurity that's just baked into the economy. Now, there are, of course, existing economists have a range of explanations for secular stagnation. There are, of course, supply side explanations like Robert Gordon, who just says, we had a lot of technology in the past, we picked all the low hanging fruit, and now there's just really not that much left. So it's a technological exhaustion story. And that's been opposed to demand side explanations like Larry Summers, who talks about the savings glut, over-saving in China, maybe also associated with inequality around the world, and the need for just greater public investment. So my account is different than the economists. I give what I call a social structural explanation, which focuses on the long-term social structural change in the economy. In short, what I argue is that industrial expansion was the main engine of economic growth over the long history of capitalism. And that's what was pulling labor into industry and generating, if not the reality, at least the possibility of a high overall demand for labor. That was, of course, mediated by social institutions. Post-war global trade created the conditions for technological advance to leap forward. And this is after World War II. But it also created conditions, especially in the context of global decolonization, for technological diffusion across the world. In my account, it's this global diffusion of technology that's more important than the pushing out of the technological frontier that is in explaining these recent trends. I argue that due to this technological diffusion, what we've seen is that global markets have become increasingly oversupplied as countries are producing more and more of the same kinds of goods. There's industrial redundancy and heightened competition, and that's leading to declining rates of investment and also declining rates of industrial expansion the world over. And in this context, as industrial growth is increasingly running down, services are failing to serve as a viable replacement because services are endemically marked by low rates of productivity growth. And the result over time is a long-term stagnation in the economy. Now, I'm just giving you here a very brief account of what I'm going to argue, that the real core of this dynamic is the running down of the industrial growth engine and the absence of any alternative to it, especially not in the service sector. I'm going to go into that in much more detail in my talk and give you a bunch of examples. Now, in the book, I try to really, again, make this a global account. I talk about a range of different medium and low income countries. Here, I'm going to focus on the three major high income countries, the United States, Japan, and Germany, because it's easiest for me to focus on those to give you a succinct account. I have added to the presentation the equivalent metrics for Brazil, so we can kind of bring it in to a more national context as well in the question and answer component of the talk. So in order to make my argument, I'm going to focus in the empirical portion first on manufacturing. And there's a few different reasons for this. So this is talking about manufacturing to evaluate the automation theorist's account. There's a few reasons to focus on manufacturing. One is just that manufacturing, it's very easy to study automation in manufacturing because we have good statistics on the adoption of robots in the manufacturing sectors of countries across the world. And you can see here, I've highlighted Germany, Japan, and the United States are some of the countries with, according to the International Federation of Robots, the most robots installed per manufacturing worker in the world. Now, these aren't the top countries. You can see that South Korea and Singapore have more robots per worker, and more than the United States, actually Sweden and Denmark are highly roboticized in terms of their manufacturing sectors. That will be important later on in the talk. Note that the United States is actually behind other advanced industrial countries in adopting these kinds of technologies. I'll come back to that fact in a moment. Another reason to focus on manufacturing is not just that it's easy to measure the degree of automation there, it's also that in manufacturing, the jobs apocalypse has already taken place. So most of the books about automation focus on the service sector because that's where the bulk of employment is in advanced industrial countries and actually increasingly in the world as a whole. But they have to talk about manufacturing because that's where this process of apparent automation has already taken place. So here I have a graph for you just of global waves of deindustrialization that have unfolded across the world since 1950. And I've just given a few representative countries to show how over time, more and more countries have been affected by this deindustrialization process, which I should mention is just standardly defined as deindustrialization is standardly defined as a decline in the manufacturing share of total employment. And what you can see from the graph is that even countries that didn't successfully industrialize by the measure of kind of raising their industrial employment share, countries like Brazil and South Africa, even they have begun to deindustrialize for quite a number of decades in a process that some theorists have described as premature deindustrialization. Now, some people, of course, would say, well, isn't this just because all of the manufacturing employment in the world is going to China? And it's certainly true that China's rise has come at the expense of other, especially medium-income countries' manufacturing employment shares. But what you can see here is that actually China itself actually deindustrialized in the late 1990s. It had a spurt of industrialization between 2003 and 2013, but there too we've seen deindustrialization for about 7 years. And according to the UN, the entire world has been deindustrializing since that time. So since 2013, we've had 7 or 8 years of continuous global deindustrialization. So the question is this global deindustrialization and these waves of deindustrialization really caused by these automation technologies? Is automation in manufacturing driving the loss of manufacturing employment across the world? And in order to answer that question, which I'll say no, the answer is no. But in order to answer it, I'm going to disaggregate the causes of manufacturing employment growth and decline, basically. And in order to give to understand what I'm going to say, you really just need to be reminded of 3 basic economic variables. And I'm going to give you some representative examples to show you what I mean in more detail. The first is output, by which I just mean real value added. It's in a sense the volume of production. So is the volume of production growing at a fast rate or a slow rate or declining? For employment, I'm just talking about the number of workers employed in manufacturing. I could use hours of work, but it's less available on the global level. So I just use number of workers. And productivity, as I use it here, is just output per worker. So, how many cars is each worker producing per year, in essence. There's a kind of standard accounting relationship between these concepts that I use in the talk and in the book, which is that the rate of growth of output is equal to the rate of growth of employment plus the rate of growth of productivity. It's actually on the first page of The Wealth of Nations, where Adam Smith says, what is it that's responsible for the wealth of nations? It says it's two things. It's the growth of employment and the growth of productivity. And that actually does add up in modern accounting terms. So let me just go a little bit deeper into this equation and explain what I mean, but with a few representative examples. So here I've just rearranged the equation. So it's change in output minus change in productivity equals change in employment. And again, this is just an accounting relationship. So to give you an example, let's say you have a car factory, and this car factory is expanding its production of cars by 3% per year. But productivity in the car factory is not growing at all. There's no productivity growth, no new technologies whatsoever. In that case, it would have to be true that employment is expanding in this car factory by 3% per year. So to get 3% more output, you have 3% more employment. Let's take another example of a different car factory. Here, output's expanding by 3% per year, so we're making 3% more cars every year. And productivity is growing by 3% per year in this factory. Well, in that case, employment must be not growing at all, because we can produce all of these additional cars we need with the current workers. These workers are just producing 3% more cars per year. So those are just some representative examples. Here's what's really been going on in the United States. Since 2001 to 2017, which is when the time series ends, output has been growing by about 1% per year in the entire manufacturing sector, while productivity has been growing at 3% per year. So 1 minus 3 is -2. That means that employment in manufacturing has been shrinking by 2% per year in manufacturing for roughly the past 2 decades. So you might think to yourself, wow, I mean, here is the automation theorist story. We have high rates of productivity growth, which mean that we can produce more and more in the US manufacturing sector using fewer and fewer workers. Well, that story begins to look really different once we zoom out in terms of time and kind of look at change over time since the 1950s. What we see going back, this is just the same information, but now going back to the 1950s, is that actually productivity growth rates, which is the middle bar, the light gray bar, productivity growth has been pretty steady over time. We aren't in a period of rapid technological change as measured by productivity growth in manufacturing. Instead, what we see is that the main cause of falling employment growth is just that output growth rates have been getting lower and lower, basically decade by decade. That's to say, not that they produce less manufactured goods in the US than the past, but the rate of expansion in manufacturing is getting lower and lower. And this falling rate of output growth, that stagnation of the rate of industrial expansion, is the cause of this loss of employment in manufacturing. Now, with the data I've given you so far, it at least looks like in manufacturing in the US, productivity has been stable over this long period. But there are a number of economists who I follow who argue that these statistics are actually really misleading, and that in fact, US manufacturing has seen declining productivity growth over time. So Susan Hausman from the Upjohn Institute, she disaggregates the manufacturing sector and looks at the growth rates in all the little parts of manufacturing. And what she finds is that the reason why productivity growth appears stable is because productivity has been growing at an incredible pace of more than 20% per year since the late 90s in one little subsector, the computer and electronics subsector. And she claims that that's actually because US statisticians are mismeasuring that subsector of manufacturing. The statisticians, in making their quality adjustments, are treating the expansion in the number of chips, in the speed of processing power, as if it were the same as producing more and more chips. So as the processors being produced are getting faster, they're treating that as if it were the same as producing more and more. Anyone who has a computer can tell you that, long ago, just increasing processing power just isn't as effective as having more and more computers. So removing that one little subsector, what she finds is that excluding computer and electronic products from manufacturing subtracts 1.7% per year from the sector's productivity growth rates. So that would imply that over time, productivity in manufacturing is actually really slowing down rather than remaining stable. That actually would make US manufacturing look more like its competitors. And here I've included a little screen on Brazil, which we can talk about in the Q&A, but focusing still on the high income countries, what you can see is that in Germany and Japan, as you actually see falling rates of manufacturing productivity growth. That's what I've highlighted for you since the 1950s and into the current period. Some might say, well, we would expect this because Germany and Japan, they were catching up in the past and now they've caught up to the technological frontier. But as I showed you, if you remember in that earlier graph, Germany and Japan are actually more advanced than the US in terms of implementing robots in production, and yet they have slower rates of productivity growth in the present. And the Upjohn Institute information makes the US case look more like Germany and Japan. What's the real cause of deindustrialization in Germany and Japan? Again, it's a really significant drop-off in the rate of industrial expansion in those two countries. It's the fall in the rate of output growth, not a rise in the rate of productivity growth. Note for Germany that this hasn't been a completely secular trend. Since 2001, Germany's really recovered its position in international markets. It's regained its export surplus, and the manufacturing sector has been growing a little bit more quickly. I will talk about that again in a few slides. So, but the overall argument for now is that it's not the pace of automation that's speeding up. It's really that rates of industrial expansion are slowing down. That's what's causing the loss of employment in manufacturing. Now, one might want to know why. Why is this happening? As is well known, since the 1970s, we've seen a real globalization of trade, and I locate the explanation, at least in large part, in that globalization. So here's a standard graph of the rising export share of GDP. You see, since the 1970s, there's just trade accounts for more and more of total global output. And yet, over that period, what's happened is that globalization has generated more trade redundancies than trade complementarities. That means that firms and countries across the world are producing the same sorts of goods rather than, as economists said they would, specializing in different kinds of goods and all gaining from the benefits of trade. As productive capacities expanded rapidly worldwide, the result, therefore, was increasing industrial overcapacity, which drove down rates of investment. And we can see that here. This is just the standard economic data from the World Trade Organization showing that, and the dark line here is manufacturing, that over time, as trade has expanded as a share of global GDP, the rate of manufacturing output growth worldwide has really stagnated. So manufacturing sectors, not just in the US, Germany, and Japan, but for the world economy as a whole, have been growing at a slower pace. And in my account, that's what really explains this trend of global deindustrialization and global job loss. So again, it's not about a radical transformation in technologies. It's not that automation isn't happening, but it's not happening at a faster, qualitatively different pace than in the past. It's actually happening more slowly than before. What's really the cause is this industrial overcapacity driving down rates of industrial output expansion across the world. Now, the story I'm telling is from another perspective, kind of a familiar one. I'm talking about the running down of the industrial growth engine. You could think about that as being about the transition from an industrial to a service-based economy. But what's not often talked about, or not enough, when people talk about the transition from industrial to a post-industrial world, is that this transition has been associated first with a productivity growth slowdown, second with an overall economic growth slowdown, and third with a persistently low demand for labor. So I'm just going to go through that in just a little bit more detail. And I apologize for having even more statistics to go through, but this part is very brief. So during the heyday of the industrial economy, I argue productivity growth in core industries and manufacturing was fast, but output growth was even faster, resulting in steady job creation. So in manufacturing, you had these high productivity jobs, but because the industrial economy was expanding so quickly, even though productivity was very high, you still had jobs being created in that sector. And that meant that more and more people were moving into high productivity jobs. Since the 1980s, what we've seen is that output growth rates have fallen, even though productivity growth rates have been high. And again, here, these are the standard statistics that I think the Upjohn critique suggests should be lower. But on the whole, what the consequence of this drop in output growth rates in manufacturing has been is that workers are being expelled from these high productivity jobs. So today, the economy is selecting high productivity jobs for steady employment losses. Meanwhile, in the service sector, there's also been a slowdown because actually service output depends on the growth of output in the wider economy. Services are really dependent on demand coming from other sectors of the economy for their growth. And so you've seen a slowdown here as well, lower rates of productivity growth, but lower rates of output growth, but productivity growth in services is so slow that employment still expands in the sector. And what that means is that the economy today is selecting low productivity growth jobs for steady employment expansion. So workers are pooling in these low productivity growth jobs, and that's actually lowering the long-term potential growth rate of the economy. Just to show you what I mean, here, this is for the economy as a whole, what I've highlighted. These are productivity growth rates for the US, Germany, and Japan over the same period. And what you can see is a really significant fall in productivity growth rates in all three of these countries. And I've included the numbers again for Brazil there for comparison. And you can actually see the same trend of much lower productivity growth in the recent period. Now, this, just to say, this falling productivity growth is precisely not what you would expect if automation, in the way the automation theorists talk about it, was really taking hold in a significant way across the economy. And I should note, since I didn't mention it before, that some people respond to what I'm saying by saying, well, but why would labor productivity be growing? We're talking about machines replacing workers, right? Not about workers becoming more productive. But that's just a misunderstanding of what labor productivity statistics actually measure. They don't measure the contribution of this or that worker. They just measure how much output is produced per worker. So if you start getting rid of workers, you'd see that productivity growth would get really high. So it's precisely if workers were being automated away that you'd see productivity growth rates skyrocket. And that's not what we're seeing. In fact, we're seeing falling productivity growth, not rising. And contrary, sorry to come to this graph a little late after putting it up, but contrary to what the boosters of automation have claimed, the 2010s, which was supposed to be this decade of brilliant technological change, was actually a decade of incredibly low rates of investment in new technologies in the economy. Businesses were just not investing. They were not expanding their capital stock. It was the worst decade for capital accumulation and for basically private business investment since they started counting the numbers in the 40s. So this was an incredibly stagnant decade, not a decade of major technological advance, at least in business terms, as claimed by the automation theorists. Now, as this productivity slowdown has taken place, because productivity growth is one of the major contributors to GDP growth, what we see is that as the manufacturing growth engine has run down, so too the overall rate of growth of the economy has significantly slowed over time. So you see here for the USA, Germany, and Japan, this trend of slowing growth. And again, I've put the numbers there for Brazil, and you can see a very similar trend. Here, of course, in the Brazilian case, as actually is true in the case of Germany and Japan, what really matters is that slowdown of the growth of the global market, which has made export growth, particularly in manufacturing, much harder to achieve. And without that export-driven growth, we've seen growth rates really decline across the world economy, with local exceptions like China that actually prove the rule, because China's growth has come at the expense of growth in other countries. So in any case, we've seen this long-term slowdown, this secular stagnation process associated with social structural change, as I've been claiming. And I just want to note, since I mentioned earlier, that in Germany, which I mentioned has reversed this process to some extent in manufacturing by doing very well and taking market shares in manufacturing markets worldwide, even though Germany is advanced, it hasn't stopped this trend of secular stagnation in the German economy, because meanwhile, manufacturing has just shrunk. It's become a smaller and smaller part of the economy. And that means that even when it grows more quickly, you don't see the same bump to overall growth rates. So the result of this process of slowdown, not of amazing technological changes being implemented in the economy, but a long-term slowdown in the economy, the result has been a persistently low demand for labor. And that expresses itself in these high-income countries, as I mentioned, just in higher rates of unemployment over time. And you can see there that what used to be thin spikes, like brief periods of unemployment in the 50s and 60s, increasingly become wide wedges as it takes longer and longer for the economy to recover from each recession. And it's not only a story about unemployment, but also, as I mentioned, a story about underemployment, a story about rising inequality, falling labor shares of income, which are happening, of course, across the richest countries in the world, and are also happening on the global scale, this fall in the labor share of income. Now, it's really important to note that in a slow-growing economy, workers as a whole face a low demand for their labor, but who and how experiences that really differs based on institutional factors. So in the book, I use the OECD Index of Employee Protections from Dismissal, which is a synthetic index that ranges from 0 to 6, and it just measures, how much workers are protected from being fired. And what you can see here is that in the US, workers are extremely unprotected. They are really, all workers are very dependent on what's going on in the overall labor market for their job security. And so in the United States, as unemployment rates have been higher and it's been harder to get a job, what we've seen is that the bottom 80% of the workforce has really experienced precarity and insecurity and stagnant wages. If you look at Germany and Japan, which are the other countries I've been talking about, you see that there are much stronger protections, especially for so-called permanent workers, and less so for temporary workers. And so what we've seen in most of the high-income countries is that workers who have permanent employment and who are relatively protected due to these institutional structures have still been able to fight for higher wages, even though unemployment rates have been higher. So they've been less affected by the labor market trends. But workers have been pooling in temporary or fixed contract or part-time work or other forms of non-standard work where they don't have the same benefits. And those workers have been subjected to what's been going on in the labor market. So in Europe and Japan, we see much more of a dualization of the labor market rather than a kind of persistent insecurity across the whole economy. Now, of course, the OECD generates a similar statistic for employee protections for medium and low income countries. And you can see that their protections are actually even stronger, at least as the OECD measures it, for permanent workers in many cases, but kind of varying significantly, lower for temporary workers or higher depending on the country. But of course, the key fact not expressed by this is that most employment globally, and especially in the medium and low income countries, is informal in nature. And that informal work has fewer protections than even the most unprotected work in the United States. And informal workers then are highly subject to labor market trends. So when there's a low demand for labor in the economy as a whole, they really suffer from higher insecurity and inability to expand their incomes in line with overall productivity growth, hence adding to unemployment. So the overall point of my work, just to summarize what I've been talking about, is this the end of work? The research question, the answer is no. The pace of technologically induced job destruction is not actually speeding up. In reality, economic growth rates are slowing down, and that's reducing the rate at which new jobs are being created. So, the key idea of my talk is that what we're seeing today is not a faster pace of job destruction, but actually a slower pace of job creation. And that's not due to advanced artificial intelligence and so on. It's really due to just the economy as a whole growing at a slower pace due to the social structural changes I've described. The result that results in a low demand for labor, and that provides the fundamental backdrop to the expanding digital economy. This low demand for labor reduces workers' bargaining power vis-a-vis their employers. It affects the costs and benefits of firms' investment decisions. And the result is that workers end up with a little say in how digital workplaces are structured. I would say that one consequence of what I'm saying is that when we think about insecurity in the digital economy, we should think about it not only in terms of the technologies, but in terms of the wider insecurity in the economy as a whole, which is also affecting the digital economy. It's not merely due to the technologies being implemented there, but the larger context of secular stagnation linked to this long-term process of social structural change that I've been describing. I'll also just mention that in the book, I not only go through this argument in detail with respect to high-income countries and a range of medium and low-income countries, I not only try to talk about the consequences that's had for workers based on different labor market institutions in different areas. I also talk about how governments have responded to this pattern of slowing growth and declining private investment. I talk about Keynesian stimulus measures. I talk about neoliberalism and neoliberal structural adjustment. And I talk about proposals for basic income as well as a kind of new way of thinking about this. And in the book as well, I go on to talk about alternative, more radical proposals for thinking about how to improve the conditions of workers, given this long-term social structural trend that I don't really think we'll be able to overcome. So thank you so much for listening to my talk. And I'm very excited to hear your comments and questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Aaron, for your so enlightening and compelling explanation. Many thanks for that. So now we'll have the privilege of discussing it with you, moving to the Q&A. Our audience, maybe it's worth mentioning, I guess, is composed mainly by members of the research groups that are jointly organizing this seminar. We recently discussed your work within our group, and they're about to bring some of the questions that emerged from this. But before beginning addressing their questions, I will present a set of 3 questions of mine as a moderator here. The first one, and I think more straightforward than the other 2, is the following. And you can correct me if I'm not right, but the way I see it, you present a structural picture composed by mainly a combination of technological diffusion, strengthening competition, and market exhaustion for manufactured goods, and therefore low rates of investment, low rates of growth, and employment. How do you fit financial expansion within this picture? That is financialization, as you know that many authors do. How to take account within your reasoning of the problem of the high expansion in financial or fictitious, so to speak, in a certain sense, wealth? That would be the first question of mine. The other 2 questions, in fact, are not mine properly, as they are developed mainly over what my dear friend and co-author Gabriel Tupinambá just sent me, as we are thinking together on these topics for our new book on the impact of these changes that you just present us for progressive left-wing political horizons. So here it goes. It's two questions, as I said. For the first one, from the periphery of the system, but not only, it's quite clear that full employment in capitalism is a candid illusion. And we also know that the approximations to this situation in post-war core capitalist countries was more an exception than a rule, an historical parenthesis within capitalism, so to speak, considering all the particular conditions that made it possible. It's also possible to see that the advanced capitalist societies growingly face themselves with political, social, and economic problems that are quite common, long-standing present in capitalist peripheries such as Brazil. And I here remember of Ulrich Beck saying about a Brazilianization of European labor markets. And this is to ask the following. Your previous work on the global history of unemployment was a direct influence on Frederick Jameson representing capital, where he put forward the thesis that Capital is actually a book about the capital, the Marx Capital, is actually a book about unemployment. Perhaps we could understand this to mean that rather than consider workers to be essentially employed and unemployment to be a passing condition, we should reconceptualize the relation between reserve army of labor and active labor force to mean that workers are essentially unemployed and actual employment is a passing moment in the circuit of laboring class. This inversion, of course, does not mean that in practice everyone is out of a job, but rather that work in capitalism should always be seen from the perspective of worklessness. Is that a fair assessment of how to connect your previous work on unemployment and the displacement of unemployment in your current work from a matter of fact to a social pressure driving people towards underemployment? And the second one, and final questions from my part, is the following. Moving to my final question, then you intervening more recently on debates against the digital socialists and their attempts to revisit the socialist calculation problem via computational means alone, as if the true problem was substituting money for a more precise measure for the allocation of labor and resources. And it's worth mentioning here that Paul Cockshott was here with us just some few months ago. Against this statement, this claim, you argued for the centrality of political view of production and economy in general, quoting Otto Neurath as a relevant precursor. How could you elaborate a little bit more on how you envision multidimensional measures for economy and how this connects with democracy and structuring the workplace? Isn't there something qualitatively different about dealing with this problem today, however, when the complexity of our economic system seems to prevent us from properly mapping the relevant features of our economic life from a situated point of view, say, as a members of a cooperative in the third world country, for example? How do you see the role of the state in this debate? And that's the first set of questions, 3 questions that we would like to address you, and then we move for the questions of the audience. So the floor is yours, Aaron Beck.
Great. Well, thank you. These are really great questions, and the kind of questions I like to get. So. I'm very happy to talk about these issues, and I hope I've written them down properly. So the first thing you asked me about was financialization. How do we think about financialization in this account? And I think it's very important to have an account of financialization. And I'll just say 2 things about how to approach it. I'll say overall, my approach is I think that there's a kind of shared perspective here, actually, among Marxists and radical Keynesians that you kind of see now proliferating more in response to the corona crisis. And that is to say that financialization is not, it shouldn't be seen as an independent process from the processes I'm talking about. When profit rates are falling in the economy and when investment in fixed capital is declining, basically the earnings of companies just take financialized forms. They take more liquid forms. Financialization is a symptom of the decline in fixed investment and the decline in the overall rate of growth of the economy. It's not an independent cause, it's a symptom. If profit rates rose, that financial money would actually park itself in long-term fixed investments, and we'd correspondingly see higher rates of productivity and of economic growth. But that's not happening because of the various processes I've described. There's social structural reasons for this persistent financialization in the economy. Now, a longer explanation would have to deal with two additional factors. One is that in spite of what's commonly claimed about a transition from Keynesianism to neoliberalism, what we've seen is that countries in the global north especially, and actually more recently in the global south as well, have been spending huge amounts of money to try to prop up their economies in the face of stagnation. And a lot of this additional spending takes the form of just trying through any amount of demand stimulation to get private investors to invest. And that has actually slowed the pace of this stagnation trend, and it's prevented the bottom from falling out. But the effect of it over time has been to generate this rapid appreciation of asset prices. So to participate in and kind of promote the continued financialization of the economy as an alternative to depression. The other thing you'd really have to look at is international trade relations and the relationship between the way that the exit from the gold standard, which was the end of Bretton Woods, was a response to the trends that I've been describing, and that has been associated with the rise of major surplus countries, and obviously the U.S. is a deficit country. I'm not going to go into that in detail. I'll just say that if you're interested in my take on that, I wrote a review in the New Left Review of Pettis and Klein's Trade Wars or Class Wars that tries to go into those global trade financial dynamics. But the overall message that I would have is to say that this financialization trend is a symptom of the stagnation that I've been describing. And that's why it hasn't been associated with some takeoff into some new immaterial phase of capitalism, but instead has been associated with recurrent major financial crises. And of course, many of these have been global crises. One of the biggest ones was, of course, one that affected Latin America, especially in 1982. But there's been a series of these crises that have blown up all around the world in response to these trends. And again, there's been no transition to a form of immaterial production. It's rather an accompaniment of stagnation. Okay, enough on financialization, though I'm happy to talk about it more. On the question of thinking about full employment as an illusion, thinking about how work should be seen, and especially taking a global view, not just a focus on countries like the United States alone, to say that work is a kind of transition to worklessness. On the whole, that's been a major message of my work, and it's been especially about looking at non-global North countries to give a better account of the character of work in capitalist societies. One thing that I've kind of developed in the course of my research that I think is really important is to criticize not only the notion of full employment, but actually the notion of unemployment that corresponds to the notion of full employment. In some ways, one way of thinking about what full employment regimes did in the post-war period is actually that they tried to normalize what it meant to not have a job. So what corresponds to full employment is the notion that unemployment will be a short period in which you don't have any work. It's a period between jobs in which you will be supported by a state-derived unemployment insurance income. And actually, that effort to stabilize and standardize the experience of not having work as unemployment was the crucial feature of this full employment regime. That is to say that people's experience of not having work would appear as brief periods of unemployment corresponding to downturns in the business cycle and receiving state support. As we know, since the end of the full employment regime, and permanently on the global scale, as more and more workers worldwide have become dependent on working, on selling their labor in order to survive, that normalization of the experience of being without work as unemployment has either broken down or failed to come into existence at all. And so what we see on the global scale is that when people don't have work, it doesn't express itself characteristically as being fully without work, as it would, though it still does in the course of downturns. Much more the case is that regardless of where we are in the business cycle, people are locked into forms of underemployment, by which I don't just mean the way that term is defined now in ILO terms, just as employment less than full time. I mean a wider, substantial sense of underemployment as people, basically being income insecure as a result of being job insecure, being very concerned about their wages, not being able to use skills that they've acquired, taking less good working conditions, and so on and so on. So it's all these multidimensional features of insecurity that I'm talking about. So to think about the story you described, I mean, in terms of Marx, since you mentioned it, and I've worked with that a lot as well. In Marx, there's three forms of what he calls the surplus population. There's the latent form, which is what economists used to call disguised unemployment, people who are working on farms but are just on the edge, ready to go to the city at any notice of a job being available. He talks about the floating form of surplus population, which is like what we call unemployment, people who are temporarily out of work due to downturn in the business cycle, and what he called stagnant forms of surplus population, which is very close to what we call today the informal sector of the economy. And Marx believed that the long-term tendency of the capitalist economy was that the stagnant form of surplus population would become the modal form, the most common form of being in a surplus population in a capitalist economy, not the floating form. The claim of the kind of global full employment project was to make the floating form, i.e. what we call unemployment, the main form. And that project failed, and now we've seen a return to a world in which worklessness takes these variety of forms, where it's not concentrated in a certain part of the population being wholly without jobs, but large sections of the population lacking work to some extent rather than lacking work completely, and instead being employed in various insecure forms. And I wrote an article about that on the ILO and the explosion of their concept of unemployment on the global scale, in which Brazil and other, as you said, countries on the periphery or the semi-periphery play an important role, which I'd be happy to share with anyone. As for the third question, so now we're moving really across a really big range of topics. We're talking about how this story I've told about automation links to an account of possibilities of socialism in the 21st century and digital socialism, and my critique of the idea that the money economy and the kind of capitalist optimization algorithms, the money algorithms, can be replaced with some more advanced and efficient algorithm, a digital one based on linear programming. And I criticize that by saying that what we need instead is a multi-dimensional form of decision making that allows, the problem I say with the capitalist economy is that locally rational decisions on the part of capitalists generate globally irrational outcomes, because optimizing just on efficiency creates all kinds of other problems that aren't taken into account. And I'm not only talking there about the global climate crisis, although of course that's the biggest thing, but also about the effects on communities, the effects on workers at work, and so on and so on. There's all of these different factors that need to be taken into account. And the question is, well, isn't the economy just too complicated to have all of this discussion? And yes, I completely agree. So in my account, what I try to differentiate between is the need to use digital technologies to handle or make possible a different way of allocating producer goods to the different services and industries that need to use them. So you need a kind of allocation protocol that's non-discursive, and that essentially uses, I don't know, it's a little complicated to explain, but in essence, you need a non-discursive form of allocating existing production resources to the different bodies that could use them. Where we want to focus our energies for discussion and multi-criteria decision-making protocols is really around investment decisions, which shape the overall apparatus. What kinds of goods and services we want to produce more of, which ones we think are toxic or bad for the environment or bad for workers that we want to produce less of, what kinds of interventions we want to make into our economy or into our social structure. Once we remove the profitability condition for investment and rather just see investment as a set of resources and time and skills that we've set aside to improve well-being in any way available that we can find, and we just have to prioritize them. That different view of investment is not guided by value, not guided exclusively by efficiency concerns. That's the realm in which we can have those multi-criteria decisions being made. So around investment, around the dynamics of the system. And the dynamics are typically what are under-described in a lot of the existing models of socialism, except in the case, I would say, of Pat Devine, who's been a big influence on me on these questions. So, and the way that would be handled is by taking our investment resources and really dividing them up on geographic terms, in terms of regions and local level participation, as well as in sectoral terms, and also in global terms, different kinds of projects, which I discussed in the account, like drives to improve productivity, to improve sustainability, and so on, coming from the global scale. But it's precisely by differentiating and kind of bringing down to the lowest skill that is adequate to the decision around investment that we can make those multi-criteria decision-making structures work. And by digitizing them and turning them into, as I call it, protocols, that's how we can kind of reduce the amount of time it takes to make those decisions. And I'm writing about this now, but it would require all these additional mediations in society, not just the participation of workplaces, but the participation of all kinds of community associations and free associations and associations of producers with certain skills to kind of make those decisions both legible and give them the best chance of actually increasing human flourishing. So I've just talked for a long time, but I'm really excited to hear your other thoughts and questions. So I'll turn the mic back to you. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Aaron. I would have lots of some reactions to your, so interesting answers, but I must give floor also to the other questions, and it would be great to debate more on financialization, on the role of state, monetary against financial stimulus, considering not only pandemic, but before pandemic scenario, hard Keynesians and Marxists, and so on and so forth. It would be a great conversation, but yeah, let's move to the next questions. There is some respectable number of questions to be covered here. So let's begin with next set of 3 questions. And the first one is from Professor Astor. And here it follows. Aaron, you claim that industrial overcapacity is the cause for slow investment rates in the manufacturing sector, hence its failure as an engine of growth and the low demand for labor. But how can overcapacity be persistent, sustaining for 40 years without closures and shutdown of factories, adjusting capacity in the long term? So that's the first question coming from Professor Astor. And then we move to the question from Oscar, PhD student in the Federal University of Ceará, the graduate program in sociology. Oscar question, in your paper at the New Left Review, you admit that although automation is not determining is not the determining cause. It is a secondary cause for the decrease on the demand of work in a slow growing economy. And Oscar continues, your analysis focuses in the manufacturing, but won't automation assume a more severe aspect in services, lowering even more the demand of work, contributing for pushing workers to underemployment? So here's the second question from Oscar. And then we go to the third question, and I guess it's not just only one, right, Fernanda? But anyways, let's collect Fernanda's questions. And Professors Fernanda Ultramari questions. Fernanda is a professor in economics at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Norte, also fellow colleague of ours. And Fernanda asks, would you then consider that information technology sectors are absorbing most of manufacturing unemployment? And she continues, do you consider now, do you consider it as a simple service sectors despite being highly complex with a high capacity to add value softwares and being highly interrelated with manufacturing? And here Fernanda continues, besides, is it possible? Yeah. Besides, could you clarify the relationship you place between the rate of economic growth and deindustrialization and the increasing unemployment? Let's continue with Fernanda's statement. If the growth rate may be lower because the industrialization is taking place, and if the industrialization is partly caused by tech advances, wouldn't this advance be responsible for the fall in employment? Lastly, what considerations would you make in your analysis considering the specificities of each country when generalizing your results, especially in the case of developing countries, which in some periods presented high rates of technological development? So here we have the first set of questions, not only three, right, Aaron? But I guess we could group them in your answer, and then after your answers, we move to the other questions from the audience. It's on yours again, Aaron.
Great, thank you. And these questions actually are nicely paired because they treat similar types of questions. So first question is, how can overcapacity be sustained for 40 years? Isn't that enough time to clear out the excesses and make, and bring us back to growth? Well, I think that there's two main issues here explaining that. One is that so many countries, the condition of overcapacity is actually much worse in agriculture than it is in manufacturing. So in agriculture, really as the various theories of underdevelopment claimed in the 50s and 60s, it really was true that terms of trade between 1950 and 2010 moved severely against agricultural production. And what that meant was that any country that continued to rely on agricultural production did worse and worse in international markets. They had to export more and more just to remain in place. And that was actually a big problem for even countries like Brazil, of course, during the era of import substitution industrialization, because they actually still relied a lot on agricultural exports to get foreign exchange. And so because overproduction has actually been substantially worse in agriculture, and there the industrialization of agriculture and the appearance of all of these petrochemical substitutes for previously natural inputs into production, because that process has been so bad, what we've seen is like a massive movement into industry, even for countries that, even though the condition of manufacturing is beset by overcapacity, it still makes sense for countries to do everything they can to help local manufacturers break into manufacturing. And so what we've seen is this incredible push of countries around the world to get some of their firms online in global manufacturing supply chains. And so that has explained the phenomenon of why entry into the manufacturing sector continues. So even as high-cost producers are being destroyed in the rich countries, so much additional capacity is coming online globally. That was already true before China devalued its currency in the mid-90s and started to take explosive growth in the late 90s and early 2000s. It was already the case on the world scale. And then, of course, it became much more severe there. And now we have countries in continued expansion into these markets of countries in Southeast Asia and even in Eastern Africa. So the process of too much entry continues. On the other hand, I think unexplained, as it were, in some sense by Robert Brenner, the economist I rely, or economic historian I rely on for some of this analysis, is just the fact that I think in many of these countries there is a kind of demand story. And I have to say, I haven't fully integrated this into my account, where instead of manufacturing, instead of there being another possible wave of manufacturing growth and boom beyond the one we've seen in the past, there just really aren't options like that going forward. And what that means is that because the only option, if you're going to lose manufacturing capacity, is to sink further and further into this process of stagnation, high-income countries have done everything they can to promote productivity growth and promote expansion among the firms that they still have in manufacturing. So that explains why there hasn't been enough exit from the economy, because governments in rich countries have really tried to do everything they can to maintain manufacturing capacity in the sector. So that's why too much entry and too little exit explain the persistence of overcapacity. But I think on the whole, just the fact that manufacturing is shrinking as a share of the global economy means that it's able to generate less growth anyway. And also any new sectors that have come on, any new products that have come online since overcapacity started have been affected by the same kinds of trends. So digital technologies are affected by, digital products are affected by even more severe overcapacity than older products like cars and so on. So that technological diffusion story, I think, plays a really big role in explaining why there aren't possibilities for future booms in the sector haven't been forthcoming. On the question of automation as a secondary cause, it definitely is. And my account is not to say that productivity growth doesn't play a role. Automation has been happening. I try to say this more clearly in the book than I said it in the articles that I originally wrote. Automation is happening at all times, you know, and in fact, the recent estimates for how many jobs are going to be gotten rid of by automation technologies today sort of pale in comparison to how many jobs were destroyed in the past. Like in the past, productivity growth was much higher and so many jobs were destroyed. It's just in the past, many jobs were also being created. So it's not that automation isn't happening now. It's that it is happening. It's always happening in capitalism. It's just not happening at a qualitatively faster pace than it did previously. It's actually happening at a slower pace than it did before. But precisely because the economy is growing so slowly, even the slower pace of job destruction is creating major problems for the economy, because the economy is not generating new jobs. And so that's why automation is a secondary cause. It's not that it's speeding up, it's actually slowing down, but because it's still happening, it is, in a sense, one of the main factors that's causing the low demand for labor. And as I explained in the book, it's definitely true that if these new technologies are able to automate additional or industrialize additional sectors of the economy, like in services that hadn't been industrialized before, it could cause major job loss in those fields. So in the advanced countries, they often talk about driverless cars being this technology that could suddenly wipe out trucking and all different kinds of taxi services and so on. More recently, we've been told that driverless cars are actually probably still at least 20 years away. And the danger of that flip in technology getting rid of a lot of service jobs seems much less likely than it did before. It's still true that warehouse work and other kinds of logistic work have been really industrialized, and jobs have disappeared in those fields, and that has had effect on high wage earners losing their jobs in those areas. The most concerning version of this, I say, on the global scale has been in areas like cloud computing, which has gotten rid of a lot of offshored IT work in countries like India. The possibility of new kinds of sewing technologies, which might actually obliterate a lot of apparel work in the global economy. I know that's not in services, but it's a really big danger for a lot of low-income producers worldwide. So it is the case that breakthroughs, not in the economy as a whole, but in certain sectors that make possible mechanization and industrialization in those sectors, or automation when it wasn't possible before, really could lead to job loss. And I think that in a lot of ways, the focus has been on a few jobs that people are worried about in the high-income countries. I'm worried much more about how specific technologies could get rid of jobs in medium and low-income countries a lot more. The third question about IT sectors absorbing work from manufacturing. In general, I think the response people have made to this is that it's a matter of scale. It's just not the case that as many jobs are being created in computer programming as are being lost in manufacturing. So there are, of course, jobs, high-wage jobs emerging in those fields, but they're relatively fewer. And that has meant that a lot of people losing jobs in manufacturing, of course, lack the education in any case to be able to become computer programmers. But there's so much more people losing those jobs than jobs are opening in IT, and that's causing these kinds of polarization trends that some economists talk about. As for the relationship between the rate of economic growth and deindustrialization, I mean, my story here, in a lot of ways, I think is a kind of a standard story that says that high-speed growth was also about structural change, and it was about economies that were industrializing and moving workers into not just raising productivity growth rates for the economy as a whole, and that being a source of higher growth rates, but also social structural change, that workers are leaving low productivity jobs and entering high productivity jobs. And what we've seen since the 70s is a reversal of that. So workers are exiting high productivity jobs. Productivity growth rates are slowing in the economy as a whole, and that's being made worse by the fact that workers are exiting high productivity growth jobs for low productivity growth ones. So deindustrialization is both a cause of slowing economic growth related to these global trends that I've been describing. So deindustrialization, falling rates of industrial expansion are a cause of lower rates of overall economic growth. And then on the backside, they're also lowering potential growth rates in the future as more and more workers are sort of pooling in these low productivity jobs. So it's kind of a standard standard story about long-term growth trajectories, and it relies a lot on the work of William Baumol, who was a former president of the AEA, and his theory of the cost disease, which I think is a really incredible theory of what happens in the long term. Also, I didn't talk about, but I've written about demographic trends being a very important part of the story, and the trend in a lot of countries in the world towards declining rates of population growth and hence labor force growth, because that's also actually a major contributor to economic growth. As countries' populations and labor forces grow less quickly, that's a major drag on growth rates as well. So I'll leave it there and turn it back to you for some more questions.
Yeah, great, Aaron. Sure, these trends are very important, and somehow, I guess, they're related to the questions that are following here. Because the next one, and I guess it's the final block, right? We have just more 3 questions, and that would amount for the time that we have for the whole activity. So yeah, the trends that you just mentioned probably is somehow touched by the Rafael question. Rafael is a PhD student in economics at the University of Brasilia, and after saying it was an amazing presentation, he presents his question as the following: the income elasticity of manufactured goods is normally big and greater than the other goods and services. How are your measures for manufactured goods demand? And then Rafael asks, are they increasing but not enough to face increased competition? Otherwise, if it is a problem of lack of investment, capital goods demand, why this investment crisis has been happening? And maybe it's somehow related to the other trends that you've just mentioned. And then we go to Rodrigo questions. Rodrigo is a professor at the Federal Institute of Ceará here. And Rodrigo is saying your main point questions a maximalist perspective in terms of the perception of how automation tends to change the actual existence of human labor and hence capitalism itself. That said, do you consider that we are experiencing a period of relevant qualitative change in the way capitalism works because of technological development, even if it does not mean the end of work? And finally, we get back to some questions from Professor Esther again, and as the following: part of the loss of manufacturing jobs can be attributed to a mere statistical reclassification along with the process of outsourcing. In some cases, we have still the same job being performed, but now under the rubric of services instead of manufacturing. What is the impact of these processes on your measures of deindustrialization? And with that, I guess we have the final block of questions, the final set of 3 questions for your answers, Aaron.
So these are really interesting questions. And I just want to admit, with respect to the first question, that this has been my big question, coming out of writing this book and talking especially with economists, because let me see how well I can explain this briefly. There is an existing economist account of the deindustrialization trend that I've been describing. And in a way, it's similar to the account that I've given because it focuses on the idea of output-led deindustrialization, not productivity-led deindustrialization. That is to say that economists who study the question agree that the reason for manufacturing job loss is not a qualitative leap upwards in productivity growth rates, but a long-term downward trend in the rate of growth of output. They explain that, however, differently than I do. And what they do is they say that the income elasticity of demand for manufacturing eventually falls after a certain point in the evolution of a country's economy. So as the economy grows, there's a turning point at which the income elasticity of demand for manufactured goods falls. And that argument, in my view, has always been suspect because it takes a global account of something that happened to a number of countries at a distinct period of time. That is to say, most advanced countries deindustrialized in the early, basically between 1968 and 1977. So in my view, trying to disentangle them and treat them as independent observations instead of thinking about the global economy is a kind of mistake at the statistical level. And the way I thought that this was revealed, which has also now been accepted by a lot of economists, including most famously, though he actually, other economists working outside of the global north actually made this claim before he did, but he's been the most famous to say it because he's at Harvard. They've called it premature deindustrialization because what they find is that around the world, more and more countries are deindustrializing, but they're not doing it at that level that turning point that was described in the earlier literature. Countries are deindustrializing since the 80s across the world with much lower levels of GDP per capita. So they haven't achieved that turning point. That's why it's called premature deindustrialization. So my account is to say the only way to explain this phenomenon in a way that doesn't require each country in its own internal evolution to reach this turning point is to have a more global account in which we look at the trade relations. And then if you look at just the actual history of what's happened in the 1960s, the penetration of German and Japanese and French imports into the United States, the conflicts around trade, the breakdown of Bretton Woods, changes in currency, global financial crises already in the early 1980s. And you start to look at what actually happened historically. It's much easier, I think, to explain in the global trade terms that I have why there's been this cascading wave of deindustrialization that's even affected countries with much lower rates, lower GDP per capita levels, hence not going through the evolutionary transformation. But, and here again, maybe I'm going a little too long, but what's been pointed out to me is it could actually be the case still that in the most advanced global north countries, there really was this change in the character of demand. And because those countries' markets are so important for global markets, the changes in the demand composition in the highest income countries, and especially the United States, could have set a kind of ceiling on the rate of growth of global demand for manufacturers in export markets. And once that ceiling was in place, it kind of it made this overcapacity problem substantially worse, and it accelerated these transitions for other countries. So I think there is an account that links this demand story, this evolutionary demand story, to the overcapacity story I've been telling, but I haven't really figured it out, and I haven't found anyone else who's figured it out either. So that might be a very long-winded and technical explanation, but this is a really crucial issue in my mind. So on the second question, okay, I've countered, this maximalist account that work is ending, but surely we are seeing that work is changing. And I think, the answer, maybe really unsatisfying, is of course to say, well, yes, in certain ways, of course, it is changing, and in certain ways, it isn't, right? Part of that is to say, yes, as in the past, so in the future, capitalism is a whole series of qualitative changes in the conditions of life and work. And so, of course, we should expect that to happen in the future. But I would just point out that this long-term stagnation trend, if it continues, is kind of slowing the pace of change, and it's also an independent cause of workers' insecurity. I think too often insecurity in the gig economy is attributed to technologies being adopted in the gig economy. And what's missing from that story is the wider conditions of insecurity that also affect many workers outside of the gig sector, as well as changes in government policies as governments try to stimulate private investment by flexibilizing work and by basically allowing workers to be more insecure and not protecting them. So I'm saying that there's this larger context of macro trends and social structural change and institutions that we need to take into account. But within that, of course, it's true that as in the past, so also in the future, qualitative changes are taking place. They're just part of this, I want to look at also the long-term social structural trends that have been unfolding for a very long time through this sequence and over the course of this sequence of qualitative technological changes. So an unsatisfying, a little bit yes, a little bit no type of answer. The third question is a really great question. About, isn't this story of deindustrialization, at least in part, a story about reclassification of jobs? And the answer is yes, it is definitely the case that, especially as manufacturing has been hit by high competition, companies everywhere have focused on their so-called core competencies. They've, spiraled off. There's even a concept of so-called the fissuring of the workplace to explain this outsourcing trend. It's definitely true. The thing is that it only explains a small portion of the changes in manufacturing employment over time. And we can, people have done detailed studies of this by looking at occupations and looking at the degree to which services are, what share of services are inputs to business processes rather than being sold directly to consumers, to try to estimate the degree of this reclassification effect. But over time, deindustrialization has just been continuing for so long, and it's been so severe that it's clear that that only accounts for a portion of what's happening, and certainly not the majority of the job loss taking place. So yes, reclassification is part of it, but it just cannot be the dominant explanation for what's happening. Although I think that fissuring story, in a kind of broader sense, is a bigger story about how employers have been keeping their employees at arm's length and making those employees take on many more of the risks of employment. So I'll just say also, since that was the last round of questions, thank you so much for these questions. They were very wide-ranging and give me a lot to think about. And it's just been it's so odd to say this to a group of people that I can't see, but I just am really thankful that you took the time to listen to my presentation and ask me about it and to get your comments. And, I hope one day in some other context, I'll be able to actually meet you in person and have these kind of exchanges face to face, which is, of course, the way that they're meant to be had. So thank you again for the opportunity.
Thanks a lot, Aaron. It was a great talk, a great presentation, and a fantastic debate. Thanks a lot for your generosity, having giving your time for us for so long. I know it's late in Germany right now. We are a little bit beyond time, and I guess you made your final remarks, but you have some time for it if you wanted. And this is to thank you once more for the opportunity of having you here, and to wish that we further strengthen some kind of collaboration in the future, especially bringing you here in Brazil personally, if possible, and meeting you in Germany or US in the near future, if possible as well. So yeah, I know for sure that many of us will have lots of more questions to ask for you. I myself would have some questions on state, role and all that, and lots of issues. But yeah, we are a little bit beyond time. I'm sure you're tired for all this, through the force that you had here. And yeah, you have a time for your final considerations if you want, but if not, from our part, it was a great pleasure to have you here. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity. It's been great to talk, and yeah, opportunities for talking in the future would be amazing. And I would love to come visit, Brazil and your universities in the future if there's an opportunity that arises. So thank you so much again for having me.
Okay, Aaron, I hope to see you one day. And once more, congratulations on your great book. It was a great talk. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you all for your presence here today, for this talk, the debate, and we see each other in the next episode of the webinar.